is Cecilia Heffron, and I am the media coordinator at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And today I have with me Dr. Steve Suppan, who is a senior policy analyst at IATP. And he's with us today to discuss a topic that's been making the news headlines quite a bit recently, and that is COVID-19, the meat supply, and meat processing workers' safety. Steve, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
I'm Steve Suppan. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and I've been working there since 1994. One of my responsibilities is to work on food safety issues and the relationship between food safety and food worker safety. And so my mentor at IATP was our board treasurer, Rod Leonard, who worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture for about 15 years, and was a high-level administrator, and introduced me to world of meat hygiene rules and how, beginning in the Clinton administration, they essentially allowed meatpacking plants, poultry processing plants to regulate themselves and speed up the production lines, which meant that both the meat products and the workers were less safe. Mm-hmm. So this present context of allowing the meat processing plants to regulate themselves had disastrous public health consequences as a result of COVID-19.
Yes, of course. So recently in the news, we've seen a lot of information about disruptions to the meat supply chain and kind of threats of impending beef and pork shortages in the United States. I think, in fact, the CEO of Smithfield Foods recently said that if these meat processing plants don't operate as usual, grocery stores won't be able to keep their shelves stocked. So could you tell us a little bit if there's truth to that statement and to these threats of meat scarcity in the United States?
Well, I think in a blog I wrote about this, I characterized this as a half-truth. Because the meat packing and poultry processing companies have millions of pounds of product in cold storage. In the case of frozen pork products, the National Agricultural Statistics Service said that at the end of March, they had 622 million pounds on hand. Now, the issue is, which retail destinations require fresh meat versus frozen meat. Mm-hmm. For example, Wendy's advertises that they have fresh meat in their hamburgers. But I'm looking at this in the context of a national emergency. And I think in the context of a national emergency, you use all the supply chain flexibility that you have to buy time to slow down production and protect your workers and protect the public from COVID-19. And so that was sort of the overall message in my blog is we're in a national emergency. Mm-hmm. The meat and poultry industry are treating this as if COVID-19 was just something to be swept away so they get back to business as usual. And, the packers have a lot more options. The Trump administration has a lot of options to both keep workers safe and keep meat and poultry products supplied. Now, one of the things that I don't think I talked about enough maybe in the blog is that, this quarter, the United States exported record amounts of meat. In the case of pork, the Smithfield is a subsidiary of the WH Group in China, and so Smithfield was, shipping huge amounts of frozen pork to China. So, the focus on domestic food scarcity really is deceptive. And in addition to that, it exacerbates the national public health crisis by forcing these workers back to work, even if they are ill with COVID-19.
Yeah. Well, so you just mentioned that we have meat in cold storage, and I believe the USDA reports numbers of how much we have in storage. So how much really does the United States have stored away, and how long could that last us if we used that storage strategically right now?
Well, again, there are complications. Obviously, the large majority of restaurants are just operating on takeout, although I guess a few in Georgia and a few other states are very gingerly opening up.
Mm-hmm.
So those restaurants may have fresh meat contract supplies, but there are ways of using this huge strategic reserve on a kind of conservative estimate. And the depletion rate of our national cold storage is not linear by any means. There's panic buying, which the meatpacking companies are encouraging. There are exports. There are holiday buying when people buy more meat and poultry products. But I think it's not unreasonable to say 12 to 14 months of supply, during which meat packers could redesign their production lines to maintain social distancing and to enable sick meatpacking employees, poultry processing employees, to remain at home if the companies offered them paid sick leave, which is the logical thing they should do in the midst of a national emergency.
So you mentioned that we'd be able to slow down production so meat processing plants could allow for the maintaining of social distancing. I believe that OSHA and USDA issued guidelines to meat and poultry processing plants on how to protect their workers, and I'm sure that social distancing was a part of that. Will these guidelines actually help protect workers?
Well, I mean, first, the guidelines are optional. The guidelines are weak. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration has the authority to impose an emergency temporary standard to require the meat packers and poultry processors to institute measures to require personal protective equipment, to require social distancing and so on and so forth. But they've chosen to protect the employers instead by not requiring anything of them. And in the case of some meatpacking companies, they're going back right to where they were prior to the April 28th executive order by President Trump, ordering the meatpacking companies, or rather ordering Sonny Perdue, the USDA secretary, to tell the meatpacking companies to resume production, quote, to the maximum extent possible, unquote, which is a fairly, vague executive order. And as a result, 14 meat processing plants, all of which had high rates of COVID-19 infection, are opening up. And of course, with that opening up, it's not just the workers themselves, but also their families and the larger community, which is endangered. It's gotten to the point where the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Aznar, is blaming the COVID infections on what he calls the employees' lifestyles, which is sort of a euphemism for the fact that because they are paid so little, they live in very close quarters. And while it's certainly possible that transmission could have originated at home and be brought into the plant, it obviously goes both ways. And what is worse then is that you have asymptomatic employees going out in the community and then infecting the broader community.
Okay. I just want to take a brief moment to invite anyone that's watching along with us right now to enter any questions that they have into the comment section. And as Steve will address those questions in our conversation. And actually, Steve, we have our first question, and I'll break and ask you to address the backlog of livestock and the impact on farmers.
Okay, well, the backlog of livestock, this is really an interesting question because, well, first, the National Pork Producers Council, which supported the president's executive order, also asked Sonny Perdue to buy $1 billion worth of frozen pork products in what it called, the vast oversupply. So essentially, they're confirming that there's this huge supply in the, in the public and private warehouses that report to the National Agricultural Statistics Service.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for the, for the farmers, for the ranchers, what my blog called for is that instead of having taxpayers pay for the euthanization of poultry and of livestock, that's going to occur, with the slowed down production system. Mm-hmm. Instead of having taxpayers pay for that, if you're a contract grower for these companies, you are essentially an employee. I mean, it's kind of a fiction to say that you are not an employee because you're contracted. All your production goes to a specific meatpacking plant. For those small percentage of U.S. Cattle, hog, poultry growers who are not contracted with the packers and poultry processors, USDA taxpayers would indemnify farmers for the destruction of their animals that cannot be presented for slaughter. That too is part of how you act in a national emergency, rather than, when what you want to do is try to get the entire production supply system to work together to assist, to assist control of the COVID-19 pandemic until such time as we have a successful and widely distributed and widely applied vaccine for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, yes, very good question.
Yeah. So a follow-up question to that would be then, to what extent can unions that represent meat plant workers act to protect workers? What percentage of meat plant workers are union members? Or what percentage of plants are unionized, if you know those details?
Well, I do know that some are unionized. So, the United Commercial Food Workers has unionized some plants. The extent to which they can protect those workers is very limited, as I understand it. The United Commercial and United Food and Commercial Workers Union has reported that at least, this was a month ago, 5,000 of their members had become ill with COVID-19 in meatpacking, and another 1,500 in food processing, and then 20 employees as of that date had died in meatpacking plants. So, without the assistance of an emergency, a temporary emergency standard enforced by OSHA, what the unions can do to protect their employees is relatively limited.
Okay, so
and they're informing the public. I mean, that's a very important function.
Yes, yeah. So with the executive order and now meat processing plants operating at full speed, it seems like the conditions might not change that much in meat processing plants if these guidelines aren't enforceable. So what could be done to actually flatten the curve of infection? I believe in your blog post you mentioned 5 possibilities of things that could be done right now to really help flatten the curve of infection.
Well, one thing, I mean, some meat packers are acting somewhat more responsibly than others. I mean, they are paying a slight premium to the workers to really risk their lives to return to production. But in order for meat packers not to seek a competitive advantage by having some redesign their work, their production lines to enable social distancing, and then others don't. There has to be a joint and public declaration by the meat packers, by the poultry processors, to commit them to use cold storage capacity to slow down the production speed that USDA just allows them to run their lines as fast as they wish to. Then they would have to also, announce their support for OSHA to apply this emergency standard of worker protection. And then they would, instead of these, optional guidelines, there's a COVID every worker protection plan or act that's in Congress. Obviously, that will not be passed in time to affect to help these workers, but they could announce their support for that. Okay. I think a huge disincentive right now, obviously for the workers, is that they don't have paid sick leave, and so the packers, the processors, should be jointly announcing their support for paid sick leave, and the Trump administration should be telling governors not to threaten their workers with loss of unemployment insurance if they don't show up for work because they or a family member are ill with COVID-19. I think one of the big pressures on these meat packer and poultry processor executives is Wall Street, and so they need to declare jointly that, hey, this is a national emergency, and we, the senior management, are going to take pay cuts. There's not going to be any bonuses, during this national emergency, and we are not going to be paying shareholders dividends, nor are there going to be any share buybacks to boost the price of the shares to increase bonuses for senior management during this national emergency. I mean, it's a national emergency. This is not business as usual, and they have to be able to explain to their shareholders and to the Wall Street analysts that we are acting jointly in the national interest, and so should you. And then I think, as I mentioned, they have to, pay for the loss of animals for the packer and processor contracted producers, and also, commit to paying to vaccinate all of their employees and their families, when at such time there's a successful vaccine that's been developed. And it's just astonishing to me that that there's some plants that have refused to cooperate with public health officials. JBS in Greeley, Colorado is a notorious example where, when they started to test, they had a huge percentage of their employees, including management supervisors, who had COVID-19 symptoms. And, they just shut down testing, right? Put their head in their sand, kept the public health officials out of the county, and basically, help facilitate the spread of the pandemic. So that all has to stop. I mean, that kind of voluntary measures, public relations attacks, that's got to stop.
According to the executive order, these plants, their liability is waived, correct? If employees are ill?
Well, it's not waived yet. I mean, practically speaking, it's really very difficult for for an individual employee to go to court against a corporation. But furthermore, the Trump administration is seeking a liability shield for all COVID-related illness, all COVID-related measures taken by the corporations, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is basically conditioning support for state and local budgets on Nancy Pelosi's agreement to Speaker Nancy Pelosi's agreement to a absolute liability shield. And there you would have the worst of both worlds. You would have extensive COVID infection among meatpacking employees, their families, their communities, and complete preemptive liability. So it would prevent these communities from seeking damages because obviously they are having to use vast parts of their public budget to counter the COVID pandemic. There have been a few communities that are investigating lawsuits against the packing plant in their community. And this piece of legislation, if it were enacted, would prevent governors, would prevent local communities from initiating litigation against the companies. So that would be, in business terms, it's called extreme moral hazard. This would be like the maximum moral hazard in forcing your employees to work to death, but being exempt from any liability for doing so.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to questions again from our viewers one last time. So please do feel free to submit any questions. And while you're busy typing in those questions, Steve, do you have any additional points that you want to convey to our audience before the end of this interview today?
Well, just that, this is a complicated issue. And again, I don't want to underestimate the difficulty of, distribution of meat and other, foods at the point of retail sale. Just because Costco is limiting, shoppers to 3 meat products per shopping trip does not mean that we're facing, a national supply emergency. It means that Costco is prudently trying to prevent panic buying. But again, dealing with a national emergency means that everybody contributes, and if Wendy's has to say, during the national emergency, we may not be able to supply fresh hamburger in each and every one of our hamburgers. You, the public, will have to understand that some of our hamburgers are going to be frozen meat patties because that's what's in the national cold storage supply. I don't think these are anything like the sacrifices. Right, that the workers are being asked to make right now in the entire supply chain. The largest sacrifice demanded of the not just the meat supply chain, the entire food supply chain, are at the of these meatpacking and processing employees who are working side by side in these production lines where, if, for example, the product line for poultry processing can run up to 175 carcasses per minute, right? And when it's running that fast, you can't expect to apply all of the protections that you need to. You've got to slow down that production. I'm not sure by how much. I would imagine in a redesigned poultry processing plant that it would, production speed would fall by half, maybe more than that. But if that's what's necessary to prevent a public health emergency from exploding exponentially, that's what the processing industry has to announce they are willing to do. And I think really for their reputation, it would greatly enhance their reputation as solid corporate citizens instead of as scofflaws.
Definitely. Well, it looks like we might have. I don't think we have any additional questions right now, but I'd invite everyone to take a moment to read the blog post that Steve mentioned a couple of times today. It's the URL is listed in the comments section. And the name of the blog on our website, if you want to go to the IATP's website and check it out, there is cold hard storage facts about meat packer threats of scarcity. And on our COVID Hub too, you'll read a couple of Steve's other latest written pieces and blog pieces on our website. So I encourage you all to take a few minutes to read those blog posts on our website. Also stay tuned for announcements of additional Facebook Lives. We'll be doing a few more in the coming weeks. So I invite you to tune back in to those. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time this morning to address this topic. And I think our viewers greatly benefited from the information that you shared.
Well, thank you, Cecilia, and thank you, viewers, and do support our meat and poultry plant workers. They are essential employees, just like the public health workers, and the migrant workers particularly are vulnerable to coercion. Here they are, essential workers being, constantly threatened, being underpaid, and also, threatened with legal action for not showing up sick to work. Mm-hmm. So thank you, everybody.